Hello again, team. In this screencast, we're going to start Chapter 3 and cover Sections 3.1 and 3.2. Chapter 3 is all about ecosystems, and the case study that this chapter starts off with is the loss of tropical rainforest around the world. Even though tropical rainforests only cover about 2% of the Earth's land surface, they contain about 50% of the world's biodiversity, biodiversity being the world's plant and animal species. The loss of tropical rainforests has been in the news because of fires in the Amazon. These fires were started to create room to raise cattle and produce beef, but this has devastating effects. We lose biodiversity. We also accelerate global warming when the missing trees can no longer pull carbon dioxide from the air. And it also changes regional weather patterns because forests are very important places to store water and moisture. These two satellite images show tropical rainforest deforestation in Bolivia between 1975 and 2003. On the left side, you can see how tropical rainforest deforestation always starts off with the building of roads that create access for people to come in and start developing the land. Section 3.1 talks about all the different components that help support life on Earth. We call that the Earth's life support system. The Earth's life support system has four major components. The first one is the atmosphere. Two significant parts of the atmosphere are the troposphere, which is the layer closest to the surface of the Earth and where all weather happens, and the stratosphere, which contains the ozone layer that blocks much ultraviolet light from hitting the Earth's surface. The second component is the hydrosphere, which is where all water on the Earth's surface exists. The third component is the geosphere, which is the solid Earth. The last component is the biosphere, and that's all parts of the Earth that contain life. There are processes that happen within and between these components. These processes can be periodic or happen at intervals. They can be episodic or happen occasionally, or they can be random, which means sporadic. This diagram shows those four different components of the Earth's life support system. Keep in mind that the boundaries between these components are not always very clearly defined. This diagram also shows those four components, but gives you a better idea of the scale and size of each one of those components. There are three things that sustain life on Earth. The first is the flow of energy in one single direction. Most life on Earth depends on the sun for energy. Energy makes its way from the sun through living things and then is released back into the environment or space as heat. The second thing is the cycling of nutrients through different parts of the Earth's biosphere. Think of the water cycle. Water in the ocean evaporates and condenses in the air and comes back to the ground as precipitation. The third thing is gravity. Gravity pulls molecules of air down and holds the Earth's atmosphere in place. This diagram shows how energy and nutrients move differently within an ecosystem. Notice how energy from the sun is all eventually lost as heat and never makes its way back. Also notice how nutrients are used and reused and are cycled through the ecosystem. You should have a more developed understanding of how the greenhouse effect works. First off, sunlight or solar radiation comes from the sun. It is then absorbed by the Earth's surface. The Earth's surface re-radiates that energy as infrared radiation, which we also call heat. That infrared radiation or heat is then absorbed by greenhouse gases in the air, such as carbon dioxide or methane. Section 3.2 is all about ecosystems and the components that make them up. Ecology is the study of how organisms interact with one another and with their non-living environment. There are different ways to study ecology, and ecologists can focus on different levels, such as organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, or the entire biosphere. Ecologists can also go into finer detail and look at the atoms, the molecules, and the cells that make up the broader levels above it. Ecosystems include both the living and the non-living parts of an environment. We call the living parts biotic and the non-living parts abiotic. Let's go ahead and talk about the different parts of an ecosystem. First, we have the primary producers, or autotrophs, that make their own food and also provide food for the rest of the ecosystem. Most ecosystems have producers that make food through a process called photosynthesis, in which they take carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight to produce a sugar called glucose and oxygen. Two examples of producers are the trees in this forest on the left or the algae in this lake on the right. Another example is the giant kelp that grows in the waters off the coast of California here and other places in the world. Then we have consumers. Consumers are also called heterotrophs, and they depend on other organisms for food. For example, primary consumers feed on primary producers like plants. They're also called herbivores. You also have secondary consumers that eat primary consumers, and tertiary consumers that eat secondary consumers. Carnivores that eat other animals, omnivores that eat other animals and plants are all considered consumers. This gory photo shows two different types of consumers. You have the zebra that eats grass and is a primary consumer. You also have the lion feeding on the zebra, who is a secondary consumer. This great white shark feeding on the sea lion in its mouth is also a consumer. Nature is very efficient, and there is very little waste of nutrients. Anything dead, decaying, and organic in nature is called detritus. And there are two types of organisms that depend on detritus for their nutrients. There are decomposers that break their food down externally or outside their bodies and absorb the nutrients. And then there are detritivores that feed on dead bodies. They eat their food. In these photos, we have examples of decomposers and detritivores. The mushrooms on the left absorb their food and are decomposers. The two types of birds on the right are eating their food, and they're detritivores. You can have decomposers and detritivores feeding on the same thing. The fungus and the mushrooms are decomposers here. The beetles, the ants, and the termites are detritivores. These dung beetles are detritivores. Dung is dead organic material dropped by another animal. Organisms use one of two ways to get energy from their food. In aerobic respiration, organisms use oxygen, and in anaerobic respiration, organisms do not use oxygen. Organisms that use aerobic respiration produce carbon dioxide and water as a byproduct. Organisms that use anaerobic respiration produce methane, acetic acid, or other byproducts.